start, I have to just mention this. It is being filmed, but just to let you know that the event is filmed. And the contents of the meeting, or a part of it, will appear on the United Against Injustice website in due course. You should look at that website. It has lots of information that's relevant to all of you and all your cases. That information has been checked out. In other words, if we're talking about applications to the CCRC, for example, the CCRC have been contacted, they've been asked if that is correct. So you can be sure that what is pretty accurate. But of course, it can always be added to, and it will be added to as things go along. Before I introduce the speakers, just to tell you how the day will go. There'll be 3 speakers, after which we will have questions, a coffee break, then a further 3 speakers, some more questions, and then of course the important thing for you at the end of the day is that getting together, that networking with people, speaking to people, and anyone can identify themselves during the course of the day, who they are, where they come from, take a note of it, have a look for them later and speak to them. After the day is finished, we will have a little collection bucket at the end. The event is free, completely free. You don't have to donate, of course, but it would be helpful because all of the organisations involved in it have no funding whatsoever, so it's completely funded that way. And after that, of course, we'll all be going to the Philharmonic pub just over the road to continue our networking, so I expect to see all of you there. So I suppose we might as well get on with it, unless there's no more housekeeping to do. And our first speaker is Lucy Roper, who's standing up there.
For those of you who don't know the case that I was involved in, said, is that okay? So the case that I was involved in, I was engaged to a man called Graham Hucklebury. Graham's case, he was wrongly convicted of conspiracy to commit armed robbery in March 2002. Graham was sentenced to 14 years in prison for his part in that robbery. He was unfortunate enough to be a Securicore driver, and a robbery took place in 1995 in which £6.6 million was stolen from the van. 7 years later, nobody else had been arrested, found, the robbers had never been found, and Graham was arrested and convicted of being part of that robbery. The evidence was entirely circumstantial. Graham's barrister described in 25 years at the criminal bar that he had never experienced a case that had worried or disturbed him so much. It was completely shocking to all of us. You know, none of our family have ever been involved in anything like this. None of our family have ever been in any sort of trouble before.
Man wrongly sentenced to 14 years in jail walks free.
So let me have a look about what happened next. Let's go on to what happened next. You might say, well, the battle's won, Graham's home, how fantastic. During Graham's conviction, you know, unlike any battle war, there is a massive, massive human cost. You know, Graham spent 3 years locked up, 23 hours a day for a lot of the time. Very few people believed in him. We got very, very little help and very little support. What we had before Graham went to prison, just from a personal point of view, is we were together for many years, and we were due to get married in September after Graham was actually convicted. Graham was a house husband within our family for a lot of years, and he looked after both of my children, who obviously adored him. I was a psychiatric nurse at the time, which is very helpful if you're doing this, because you meet a lot of nutters doing this, and most of them are very qualified and highly professional, but they're still nutters, and they seem to have some sort of learning difficulty in understanding common sense, but there you go. I was self-employed for about 7 years, and at the time Graham went to prison, we had a business which was turning about £100,000 a year. We had a couple of houses, we had cars, we had a lot of friends, and life was pretty rosy. When Graham went to prison, we had a whole uphill battle, and a lot of things changed in our lives, an enormous lot of things changed. just some of the things that went on. Obviously, you know, the shift from business matters shifted to personal matters. I personally was up night after night, 3, 4 in the morning, going through about 150 detailed files of legal evidence. There was very limited money available for Graham's appeal, and that meant I had to do a lot of it with friends and other people helping me. We had to raise a lot of money. Things like medical reports, we were not able to get as part of Graham's legal aid, and how we actually did that is we sold our houses and our car to do that. The type of things we had to deal with was Graham phoning from prison, pleading, begging, crying, please get me out of here, I can't cope with it. We would go to see him in Manchester prisons and find out if he transferred to the Isle of Wight. We then would be driving to the Isle of Wight every weekend to try and keep Graham's morale up, keep the troops' morale up. Immense personal battle for Graham, and the type of things that you get in response to this effort that you're putting in. For example, my MP, after me going and spending about an hour going through Graham's case, very clear, circumstantial evidence that Graham was convicted on. Anyone who ever read that case would go, what on earth is this about? I mean, who's going to take a £1,000 bribe for 6.6 million? Anyone in here? I don't think so. My MP's response was, well, you are simply a woman blinded by law. It's clear for all to see. That's the type of thing that you get when you're dealing with this. The house was burgled 4 times after Graham went to prison. I think someone was looking for 6.6 million onto the floorboards, but we came home night after night, house completely trashed. And then eventually you get battle fatigue, and there's no doubt about it. Everything deteriorated in our lives. At the last count, last year, my business made a profit of £6,000. Okay, so we had nothing left through doing all of this. We had nothing left. Graham spent a lot of time in hospital wings. He spent a lot of time very, very ill. He was diagnosed with severe post-traumatic stress disorder while he was in prison. Thank God, because actually that was the only thing that got him home. Because in Graham's case, the reason he went to prison is because we had a crap legal team initially, and there was no new evidence in his case. It just wasn't dealt with properly. So the fact that he was diagnosed with that then gave new evidence. Without that, Graham would not have got home. But the Court of Appeal judge said they didn't know whether the case had ever got to court in the first place. Some of the other things that happened. Now, this is an interesting one. In 2004, September 2004, after a huge amount of effort and a lot of personal loss and a real hard battle, and I'm quite a strong character and I've got a very big goal, and I'll go out and fight like a good one. And I became a real thorn in the side of a lot of people, there's no doubt about it. In September 2004, I just simply couldn't take anymore. Now, if this can happen to me, it can happen to anyone, so I understand fully the battle that people face. Because I had a real breakdown, and in fact I was admitted to hospital, care of social services and approved social workers with psychosis, and ended up in hospital on huge amounts of antipsychotic drugs, looking like a very dodgy scene from One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. So that can happen to me, and that is the type of thing that people suffer, that type of pressure that you simply can't take anymore. After that, I really had to pull out of it. I just simply couldn't keep up the pace that I've been keeping up. Okay, so let's go for soldiers. When they come home, I guess things are never the same. They're not the same when someone comes home. And if we look at that video, we talked about celebrations and we talked about champagne and how fantastic it was going to be. Was it like that? You bet it wasn't like that at all. Graham came home. We all sat in that minibus in silence on the way home. Nobody knew what to say to each other. Nobody had a clue what to suggest. We all felt completely at a loss. We were so exhausted with it that we actually found it really difficult when Graham actually came home. It was a real anticlimax. Shell shock is a term that's often used for PTSD. Well, my memories of that Christmas were this. The turkey stayed in the oven for 3 days. Everybody cried. I remember sitting in the graveyard at Graham's dad's grave all day, virtually Christmas Day, in tears. I did not know what to do with Graham. I did not know what to say, how to help him. It was absolutely pitiful and tragic. Graham had lost nearly 4 stone while he was in prison. He came out with a carry bag with nothing to wear. So we decided, when Graham wanted to go and get some clothes and go shopping, so I had to go and get him a whole load of clothes. Well, I don't know if you've ever been in TK Maxx one day before Christmas, but it's not to be recommended, not for the faint-hearted, not for anybody. We wandered around, myself and my friend, while we tried to show Graham clothes that he might have been able to wear. Graham loaded the clothes into a trolley and we followed him behind, taking them out of the trolley because they didn't fit, they were totally unsuitable, there were things that he would never wear, but he just didn't know where he was or what he was doing. The family really degenerated. Whilst Graham was in prison, fortunately, thank God, I met a partner who was able to support me through a lot of this, who's here with me today. Since Graham's come home, he really has been a lost soul. He has struggled enormously. To my knowledge, in the last 18 months, he's done 3 decorating jobs, and they've taken him 18 months. He would turn up at my house 5 times a day, having forgot a paintbrush, not knowing where to start, bought a paint collar that was the wrong colour, forgotten where he was going and what time he was supposed to be there. Very, very angry. There was no help, there's no phone calls, there's no support. I do a lot of work, or have done a lot of work in the past for the Ministry of Defence and the Veterans Agency. And when soldiers come home from war, especially those that are traumatised, there is a whole raft of services available. There are retreats. I know Paddy Hill has been trying to set up a retreat in Scotland for miscarriage of justice victims. It's so badly needed. People just can't come home. This is after 3 years. What about 20 years? What happens to people then? There's no media coverage of this stuff. No one tells you this is what happens afterwards. The press is so keen to follow your story all the way through the case, to give a certain side of it. This is a very one-sided battle. The people with all the ammunition are those people on the prosecution side. We had no ammunition, we had nothing, we had to do it on our own. The trauma is really intense, and you know, everything was very strange and different to Graham. Even things like going to the cash quick machine was an absolute ordeal. He'd almost be sitting on the kids because he was so traumatised that something might happen. Obviously still traumatised from the initial robbery, never mind the spending 3 years in prison. I didn't understand how Graham, I'm a psychiatric nurse with many, many years experience, and I did not understand. I was quite angry towards Graham. I couldn't understand the way that he was and the way that he was behaving when he came out. It wasn't what I expected. Shane Power, the other gentleman you saw on there, sadly died 12 months after coming out of prison from an alcohol-related disease. So he came out and drank himself to death within 12 months. It all started to make sense to me when I started to read some stuff about post-traumatic stress disorder, and a lot of people who have gone through this will have been suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. And just very briefly, there's a huge amount of studies, American research on PTSD, and Dr. Bremner in 1990 did brain scans on people who've been through extreme trauma, and he actually found that trauma eats away at the brain. It actually eats away, and it eats away at 2 bits that lay down new memories and that control your fear. So people can't do it, they can't focus and concentrate, it's not possible. The person can't help, and it's irreversible. So I know that Graham's really unlikely to change much from how he is now. Maybe a bit, maybe he'll readjust, but it's going to be a long battle. One of the saddest times in the last 12 months was Paddy Hill came to stay with me, a really dear friend of mine who's helped me through a huge amount, Paddy Hill from the Birmingham Six, and he brought with him 3 prisoners who had all had Graham's experience. And I was sat in the kitchen, crying my eyes out because I heard Graham, he talked absolutely incessantly for a whole day, and he was like a Christmas tree that had lit up, because these people knew what he'd been through. I could never offer him that, I didn't understand the same things, and for Graham, that was what he knew. And sadly, we as a family very rarely see Graham now, and if we do, it's very, very difficult. Graham gets very angry about things, he finds it very difficult to cope, he has had no support, there has been no one picking up the phone. I have tried every avenue for trauma help, for help with support, relationship, everything, and it's just very difficult to find people who've got the right sort of experience with this. Let's go on to what happens then, because people who suffered from war shock syndrome or post-traumatic stress were said to be malingerers, compensation addicts. They wanted the compensation. So we'll say we've got PTSD and we'll get a bit of that in. About 3 weeks ago, Graham was turned down for compensation by the authorities. So on top of losing everything else, he also will not have compensation. He's unlikely to be able to work again. So this is the type of thing that we're doing. So really, what I'm here for today, and the reason I said I would come, is because I went off on my own in frustration when all this was going on, and I campaigned, and yes, I got Graham home. And lots of other groups helped me. Innocent were fantastic, Paddy Hill, lots of other people. United Against Injustice, I came to all the meetings. But the important thing is, 1, don't give up the battle. 2, don't focus on your own battle, because other people are going to suffer this. This is going to go on and on. And battles cannot be won on your own. You have to rally the troops. You have to work together. United Against Injustice is a really important way of doing that. You've got to organise. You've got to have a battle plan. And, you know, a battle's not going to be won by 3 or 4 people meeting together. So, really, that was the main thing I wanted to get out of this, is just to say to people, keep going, but work together. Make sure that you carry on. And that's really all I've got to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lucy. I think that demonstrates quite clearly the need for United Against Injustice and like organisations. I'm glad to say that Bruce Kent is now in the building, so he can now take over from me. If you just give him a few moments to just settle in, so as you can see what the running order is.
Apologies everybody for arriving late. I got to Euston to discover that the train had been cancelled, and so I ran the houses, visit to Crewe, where somebody came up to me, obviously saw the red tie. I thought I was a Virgin man, and said, well, it was the next train to Stoke. I said, I'm sorry, but I'm not running the Virgin trains, thank God. And finally I got a train to Liverpool, where apparently wearing a red tie has got something to do with football. The taxi driver said, why are you wearing a red tie? Something to do with it? No. Well, here I am. I'm delighted to be here. I'm a fellow campaigner like others here, and I feel that this is I'm one of the members of Progressing Prisoners Maintaining Innocence, which is a long list of sad cases and hard cases. So I'm very glad to be associated with the general feeling around this room today. Now, without any more time for me, I'm delighted to welcome Mark Curren, a solicitor who is well experienced in all these things, and a case manager of the CCRC. Used to be a case manager of the CCRC.
My name is Mark Curren. I've been practising criminal law for about 14 years now, and almost half of that time I spent as a case review manager at the Criminal Cases Review Commission, not quite from day one of the CCRC's existence, but not far off. I propose to take up about 10-15 minutes of your time, and what I'd like to do is to compare and contrast, if you like, the early years' experience of the CCRC with some very important changes that are in the process of taking place, and to set that against the context of some wider changes in the criminal justice system, which really rather trouble me and may have an impact upon how campaigning organisations have to do things in the future. Now, a simple sentence about me: I defended people in criminal cases for about 6 years, after which I joined the Criminal Cases Review Commission about 8 months after it came into existence. I'm sure I don't need to say much to any of you about why the CCRC came into existence. In 1991, the Birmingham Six were released from prison. The then Home Secretary Michael Howard announced a Royal Commission into criminal justice. One of the key recommendations was that the power to refer potential miscarriages of justice after a first appeal onto the Court of Appeal was removed from the Home Secretary as an elected politician and placed in the hands of an independent organisation. Within that, there was at first a serious underestimate of the amount of work that would come to an independent body, and the CCRC was inundated with cases that the old Home Secretary's arrangement simply hadn't seen. And I think it's fair to say for the group of lawyers and investigators who were involved in setting up shop, it was a pretty exciting time, simply because nobody had done this work as independent public servants in the past. I think that's something that's worth repeating. For all the shortcomings, and there are many of the CCRC, and for all the shortcomings, and there are a huge number of the justice system in England and Wales, the CCRC was the first independent organisation, publicly funded, looking at miscarriages of justice anywhere in the world at any time. It had never happened, and we were feeling our way. There were a lot mistakes made in the course of feeling our way. The early staff, and again this is something I'm going to be contrasting with the position now. The staff in the early days were mainly people in their late 20s into mid-30s who had spent several years in the justice system, either as lawyers or as investigators. They usually had a few years' experience in doing what they were doing. There were never, and there never really have been, at the casework, at the case manager level of the CCRC, much in the way of senior people with substantial experience. The salary scales rather dictate that. Lawyers who are attracted to large salaries or have got to a stage of their career where they need a substantial salary to support their lifestyle are not going to be attracted to the jobs of case manager in the CCRC. The early years were often, as I've already said, pretty energetic, often rather chaotic, and there were mistakes made, but there were also some very real and long-standing miscarriages of justice that resulted in successful applications referral to the Court of Appeal and the quashing of convictions. I think it's also fair to say in the early years there was something of a sweetheart relationship between the Court of Appeal and the CCRC. In Court of Appeal judgments at that time, you'd have to look very, very hard indeed to find even the mildest criticisms of how the CCRC operated and how it referred cases on. That's certainly no longer the case. It's also the case that the Court of Appeal had and still has the power to refer appeals to the CCRC and use the Commission as an investigative tool. And that's something that the Court of Appeal has rather discontinued, I think, in the last few years. Within the Commission, there's always been rather different and often conflicting strands of opinion. There are some people, I like to think I was one of them, who took something of a radical approach and thought that the CCRC ought to be there to push for the development of the common law and take chances with cases that were maybe at the boundaries of what could be properly referred. There were people there who took a much more restrictive view of what the CCRC ought to be doing, and that applied at staff level and also at the level of the commissioners who make the decisions. Gradually over time, I feel there's been a change in relationship between the CCRC and the Court of Appeal as the place where referred cases almost always end up. The Court of Appeal has sought to assert a dominance over the CCRC, and there's been some rather harsh criticism in the last few years, and I think it would be a shame if the CCRC responded to that by cutting its cloth accordingly. I have concerns that that's actually happening. Now that I'm a solicitor in defence practice again, I'm engaged on the other side of the counter, and I am acting for a number of individuals who have applications before the Commission. One of them is a case where the Commission told me in its statement of reasons that there were perfectly good grounds for referring the case, but they weren't going to do so because we hadn't appealed the conviction. They knew from the nature of the application that about half the things that the chap I'm acting for was raising were things that only the CCRC could look at using its investigative powers. Essentially, we were suggesting that parts of the police investigation were hooky. There was a degree of support for that from the information we did know, and I found it very unlikely if I was to go to Hampshire Police and say, hello, I'm acting for an applicant, could I have a lot more discreditable information than you've got on your files? I think I could safely predict what the answer was going to be, so I went to the CCRC with that information. The CCRC investigated, thought there was nothing in those points that I was raising, but on some legal arguments said, yes, you've got a reasonable one at the Court of Appeal, but you haven't been to the Court of Appeal in the first place, so we're going to turn your application down. Now, I think that attitude is likely to discourage people from going to the Commission with matters that only the Commission can investigate. It troubles me greatly, and I don't think it's the sort of decision that the CCRC would have taken perhaps 5 or 6 years ago. Some of you may be aware that there are extensive reforms that have taken place in the way the Commission operates in the last year or so. You may not be aware because the publicity of them hasn't been great, but they aren't denying it either. When the Commission was set up by its then chairman, Fred Crawford, it had a very radical management structure that was effectively a flat structure that relied on the individual responsibility of the caseworker and the commissioner who were running an individual case. There was very little in the way of line management in the traditional civil service style. That's all changed. About 18 months to 2 years ago, the Commission paid what I suspect was rather a lot of money for the McKinsey organisation, the International Management Consultancy, to have a look at their internal structure. Now, I've never known a management consultant to go into an organisation and say, yeah, that looks okay, that's all fine, you don't really need us, it's all working okay, and we really need changing. They tend to say the exact opposite of that, don't they? Yes, you need our help in consultancy, it all needs changing. And they have effectively installed 2 extra layers of management, a director of casework who is responsible to the commissioners for the ultimate management of cases while they're in their investigative and ruminative stage, of senior caseworkers, each of whom is responsible for about half a dozen individual caseworkers and effectively line manages those people. I don't know whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but it has happened, and its impact may become obvious to people with the operation of individual cases in the next year or 2. As far as money is concerned, I mentioned earlier the honeymoon period with the authorities that the Commission had. Well, that's pretty well gone as well. In the financial year 2003 to 4, and this is all information that's in the public domain, there are no secrets I'm telling anyone here, the Commission received from the Home Office £7.8 million. Following the financial year, that was a cut to £5.75 million, so a cut of about 20%. This current financial year, that went up to £6.8 million, so about half the cut was returned to them. The number of case managers, of individual case workers, has fallen over the last 4 years from around about the 50 mark at a full complement to something in the low to mid-40s at any one time. And I have to say this is anecdotal as experience now in dealing with the CCRC on behalf of convicted people. I get the impression that the case workers they're recruiting tend to be younger, tend to be less experienced, and they are recruiting some very, very bright people, but pretty well straight from law school. That, again, I don't know whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but it certainly, I mean, there is cause for concern there that younger members of staff with less experience in how the justice system works are possibly more likely, easier to push round and easier to have the rug pulled over their eyes. That said, the casework figures over the last few years are quite interesting. The combined rate of quashed convictions and varied sentences on references from the CCRC to the Court of Appeal, so the success rate, if you like, has actually gone up a little bit from the mid-60% mark to something around 70%. It's not clear from the figures that I've seen, however, that there's been any rise in the number of references to reflect the increase in applications that the CCRC has undoubtedly had over the last 2 or 3 years. The numbers have gone up, I think, from about 850 a year to something nearer 1,000 a year. I only speak as an individual lawyer in court every day, that we've got an increasingly liberal approach to the criminal justice system. We have Home Secretaries announcing blithely, as if there's a link between the one and the other, that the amount of money that is available to people for compensation as victims of miscarriage of justice ought to be compared against the money available to victims of crime. We have politicians routinely rubbishing judgments that they don't like that are made in the appeal courts, and we have the appeal courts themselves making illiberal judgments and talking about technicalities in the way that only the tabloid press used to. I have an example of a case from a few weeks ago in the Court of Appeal called De Silva. The Court of Appeal said, "We are therefore driven to the conclusion that there was here, through no fault of the judge, a miscarriage of a technical kind. It is not, however, a misdirection which causes us to doubt the safety of the conviction." To return of the proviso, the idea that the Court of Appeal can decide that a jury was fundamentally misinformed, but the person responsible has not got an unsafe conviction and ought to stay in prison. That seems to me to be fundamentally and philosophically wrong. Whatever your feelings about the CCRC, I would say to you this in closing. Whenever there's a lazy defence lawyer who doesn't do his job, whenever there's a prosecutor who sits on inconvenient evidence rather than disclosing it, whenever there's a police officer who displays ineptitude or corruption, if that ends up in an unsafe conviction, a conviction of somebody who should never have been convicted in the first place, you've got, for example, another Graham Hucklebury. You've got a diminishing of the democracy that we ought to live in, and I hope that the CCRC will continue to remain a bulwark against that. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Mark. Very interesting indeed. I'd like to ask Kevin McMahon, who's the next speaker, to address us. Thank you.
Just to let you know, I'll only speak for a very short time, after which there'll be some questions, and then coffee outside, which is one hand, I'm afraid. Right. How do you assess the validity, the fairness, and the honesty of a police investigation? I'm going to try and tell you that. This is a rough guide, but I hope you'll get something out of it. When you're confronted with a whole mass of papers, where do you start? Well, this is one way. In order to do so, in order to look at that investigation, you've got to find some sort of window, some way of, maybe of looking into a portal maybe, to look into the minds of those investigating officers.